Whenever we are preparing salts, we have to consider whether it is soluble or insoluble and what substances go into making it. So this is the worksheet after which hopefully you will understand everything there is to know about preparation of salts. So let's start. When they react together, which pair of elements form an ionic compound? Now we understand in O levels and IGCSE that metals and non-metals, when they react together, that is when they form ionic compound because they transfer electrons. But when non-metals react with each other, they form covalent compound. So based on that, we are looking for a metal and a non-metal pair, which is option C here. The rest of them are just all non-metals. Which salt could be prepared by precipitation? Now, precipitation is a method that we specifically use for salts that are insoluble. So we have to remember the insoluble salts, which is barium sulfate, yes, lead chloride, yes. These are both insoluble salt. So that is why our answer is going to be 1 and 2. Silver is below hydrogen in the reactivity series, which row describes the chemicals used and the method of separation used to prepare a pure sample of silver chloride. Now you have to remember that silver chloride is an insoluble salt. So because this is insoluble, we use precipitation method. Now for precipitation method, you need two things which are soluble, two soluble salts that react together. Okay, so we are looking for two soluble salts, which will be obviously not A and B because they don't have two salts. They have a metal and HCl, and because silver is below hydrogen, silver will not displace hydrogen, they will not react together. So A and B can't be the answers. Silver nitrate and HCl both are soluble and they will create insoluble salt, and the method to get that out is filtration. Okay, so once you've made the salt, you're going to extract it using filtration. So for this reason, our answer is going to be D. Aqueous ammonia reacts with a compound to form a salt, ammonium phosphate. Obviously, you have ammonia, it's going to react with something with phosphate in it. Which type of reaction will ammonia undergo to form ammonium phosphate? Now, ammonia, as you know, aqueous ammonia is acidic, so it must react with something with the phosphate in there. And the phosphate ion that we'll get, all ammonium salts are soluble, so it's going to be some soluble thing that is going to react with. So we are looking for neutralization reaction, acid-base reaction, as you can see. What is the best method to prepare a sample of silver chloride? Again, it's an insoluble salt, so we are going to do precipitation. So we are going to mix two soluble salts to get one insoluble salt, so that is D. Which substance is soluble in water? Okay, so this is a plain test for solubility rules. Now based on that, we know that all carbonates are insoluble if they're not from group 1 or ammonium, so A is not the answer. Copper 2 oxide is also a black solid which is insoluble. Copper 2 hydroxide will be a slightly soluble thing, and we know that it's present in lime water, which is a saturated solution, but more than that, copper 2 hydroxide is used as slake lime to treat soil with low pH. So this is again not that soluble. We want to look for something that's extremely soluble, and that is nitrate. We know that all nitrates are soluble. Which pair of reagents are most suitable for the lab preparation of copper 2 chloride? Now for this one, you have to understand that copper 2 chloride is soluble. Now for soluble salt, we have either the crystallization technique, which we can use. So we have to see what technique we can do over here. So let's see. We have aqueous copper 2 nitrate and aqueous sodium chloride. They will both react. They will produce sodium nitrate and copper chloride. That's a double displacement reaction, but we are going to see both soluble salts reacting to make two more soluble salts. That's not going to help us. Copper and chlorine. If copper reacts with chlorine, it's not going to produce, it is going to produce copper 2 chloride, but it's not the best method for lab preparation. Copper and dilute HCl. Copper will not react with dilute HCl because copper is below hydrogen reactivity series, and with dilute acid, copper does not displace hydrogen. With concentrated it does, but that's not the option here. Copper 2 oxide, which is an insoluble solid, might be a good option because it will react with dilute HCl and will produce soluble copper 2 chloride. We just have to make sure that copper 2 oxide is in excess, so all the soluble HCl is used up. So this is going to be our answer. Lead 2 sulfate, which, as if you might remember, is insoluble, can be made by reacting dilute sulfuric acid with another substance. Okay, let's see. We want to make an insoluble salt, so we should use precipitation technique, and for that we need a soluble salt to react. And the soluble one in this list is nitrate. All nitrates are soluble, so our answer is going to be A. Moving on. Salts can be prepared in the lab in various ways. Describe a suitable method to prepare a pure dry sample of each of the named salt. Okay. In your description, you should include the names of any technique, so that's important, the apparatus you'll use, and the chemicals that we'll use. So it's important that we mention all of that detail in our answer because the examiner requires it. Alright, so we want to produce copper 2 sulfate. Now, before we start solving this, here are a few questions we should ask ourselves. Is it a soluble salt or not? So this one, copper 2 sulfate, is soluble, which means that we are going to either use a base that is soluble and react with acid, or an insoluble base and react it with acid. So those are the two options that we have. And then, is the metal that we need more reactive than hydrogen or not? In this case, copper 2 sulfate, copper is less reactive than hydrogen, so copper metal will not react with the acid. So we are looking for an insoluble solid which reacts with acid to produce this soluble salt. So there you go. Copper 2 should come from an insoluble solid. In this case, we could use copper 2 oxide. So that's the thing that will provide us with copper 2 ions. Similarly, sulfate should come from some acid, which again we know is H2SO4, sulfuric acid. So now we have the two things that we need. Now again, because this is a soluble salt, we should make sure that any soluble thing in the reactant must be limiting. It's a very important point. To make soluble salt, we need a soluble limiting reactant. So H2SO4 is going to be limiting and copper 2 oxide is going to be in excess. So you must mention that. Alright, so let's begin. We need an insoluble compound. For us, that's copper 2 oxide. A dilute acid, for us, that's H2SO4. Alright, so how do we do this? First of all, you need copper 2 oxide to be in excess. So take that in a conical flask if you don't need to heat it. But if you are planning on heating it, then they take a boiling flask. Okay, so in either way, it's going to react with acid. So we can say that add copper 2 oxide in excess. That's very important, in excess, in a conical flask. Now that you mentioned that this is in excess, you don't need to separately mention that H2SO4 should be limiting. You can just say that then followed by H2SO4. It's important that this is aqueous. You can say that use a pipette to add H2SO4 or something like that. That's up to you. Okay, now that we have it, it will react. You can say that stir it, but because the examiner did not ask for the technique at the moment, like it's not really a technique stirring, so we can just skip that part. Alright, so now they will react and then we have to filter the thing. Then you can say that filter the mixture to remove unreacted or extra or excess solid, which was CaIE. And then once you've removed it, obviously you have the filtrate. So then we'll heat the filtrate to get crystals of this thing. So we'll say heat the filtrate. It's important to mention that it's a filtrate, not the residue. Okay, heat the filtrate to crystallization point and slowly cool. This way you'll get crystals of copper 2 sulfate. Now here's the thing. What if I don't want to use copper 2 oxide? Is there any other solid I could use? Of course. I could use any insoluble compound that provides me copper and reacts with the acid. So I could use copper carbonate, I could use copper hydroxide. There's another advantage of using copper carbonate. We will be able to follow the rate of reaction because there'll be bubbles of carbon dioxide coming out. So once you know that there's no more bubble coming out, then you can stop the reaction. So that's an advantage that we have. Obviously, when you're doing it in the lab, in the exam, then you will not mention all of these extra things. So you just pick one and then add that. Moving on, we have to make an insoluble salt here, that is silver chloride. Now we need to use a precipitation reaction. Now you might remember that precipitation reaction is the one in which we use only two soluble salts to react. So obviously we need a soluble salt that gives us silver and a soluble salt that gives us chloride. Now we could use silver nitrate because all nitrates are soluble, and we could use sodium chloride because that is a soluble salt that we could use. Again, we just have to mix them together. The amounts don't really count at the moment. So we can say that mix aqueous, it's important to have them aqueous, not solids. Aqueous silver nitrate and sodium chloride. Again, this should also be aqueous. Now, you don't have to take sodium chloride. You could have taken any other soluble chloride. So don't take a halide chloride or a lead chloride or a mercury chloride, but you could use any other ones. Alright, so we have them and we mix them together. You can also say, if you don't want to mention aqueous, you can just say sodium chloride solution. That would also be fine. And then obviously we have to filter it. Always filter the mixture that you have. Always do that. And then you will obviously get the solid residue. Now remember that this is sodium silver chloride, which is insoluble. So we have to take the residue. So we mentioned that wash the residue with water. That is to make sure that any soluble impurities are not there. And then you have to get the dry sample of this thing. So then dry in folds of filter paper. And there you go. We now know how to make soluble salt, insoluble salt, the methods to use, and of course how it is tested in the exam. Good luck.